We're going to look this afternoon at Revelation chapter 16, obviously, and from verse 12. And there's a very particular message in these verses that I'm hoping all of us are going to leave with. The world around us feels wrong. I don't know about you, but the last few years have been really, really difficult. And everything just feels wrong. COVID, I think, was an incredibly corrosive time for the ecclesia, and perhaps nowhere as much as here in Melbourne. And I think we're still suffering from the effects of COVID, and that was just one thing among many. And it feels incredibly like the world is going mad. And it doesn't make any sense. This is from a survey conducted by the University of New Hampshire. They surveyed over 1,000 American adults. This also agreed with an earlier survey published by the Economist, and it showed that almost 19% of Americans, bearing in mind that this is the nation that put man on the moon, believe or aren't quite sure whether the world is round or not. Actually, that's wrong. 10% of them, 10% of them are confident that the world is in fact flat. Flat. A survey a few months earlier of 1,500 American adults showed that 20% of American adults believed it was certain or highly likely that the government were using the COVID vaccination program to implant microchips in their brains. It's just unusual, isn't it? 20%. 1 in 5. It's a nation without any ongoing civil war, and yet the number of guns in the United States of America, you look at that list, the Falkland Islands, you think, yeah, it's pretty remote, it's pretty wild. I don't know, maybe they're having to fend off packs of penguins. Yemen, well, they've got an ongoing civil war, right? United States of America. Well over 1 weapon per person. This is insanity. And the people of the United States of America are determined in their belief that they have a right to bear arms because in their mind somehow holding those weapons makes them safer. Makes them able to protect themselves despite objective evidence to the absolute opposite. Did you know that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States of America did a survey that showed that the most likely cause of death of a child was not swimming pools, was not car crash, was not childhood disease, it was getting shot at school. And we smile and hopefully we're all crying a little bit inside, and that's just mad. Because objective reality screams to us that this is wrong. The Americans continue to buy more and more guns, determined in that belief that guns make them safer, that these figures are up to date. I finished these figures yesterday, and I don't know if you can see the final line. That represents 2024 as of August 22nd. And well over halfway through, they're going to top last year. And yet, more guns, more guns, more guns. Or this. Now, my point in showing you this particular slide is not to present a racist perspective on Australia's First People. There's no way in the world I could survive in the Australian desert without a food truck following along behind and a service providing me showers every morning, right? That's not what this is about. But maybe you can't read the small typing up there, but what this is from is it's from the Australian federal government and their plan around building a curriculum for our students in all schools across Australia, and the determination that the foundation of knowledge in that curriculum should be based upon Aboriginal learning. And they want our mathematics program to be based on the advanced algebraic functions we learn from the Aboriginal culture. Now, the Aboriginal culture has many things that ours does not, that the Western culture does not. This is not a competition. But given that there is robust debate amongst ethnologists and those that study the various Aboriginal tribes, where many of them even had the number 5 in their language, or a concept of ordinality, in other words, that 4 follows 5. Pardon me, 5 follows 4. There you go. Who hasn't got a concept of ordinality? 5 follows 4. 6 follows 5. That wasn't even a concept, wasn't required in their societies, wasn't something that was necessary for their daily life. And we're saying we're going to build a program of education for our mathematicians of the future based on that. This is a denial of objective reality. Again, up to date. It's probably gone up a little bit since this was done. March 2024, ongoing surveys about the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. 30% of Americans still believe that Trump was robbed, despite objective reality in all polls that there was no fraud. The world we live in is going mad. I don't know how many of you remember this. Israel Folau. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. He got fired by Rugby Australia over an online post in which he stated his private and personal belief that hell awaited those with immoral lifestyles. Now, we all know that some people treat sport like a religion. This story was madness. This was sport at war with religion, rugby at war with the church. And it felt like the media in the sporting world lost sight of reality. Here's a man who's merely put up a post of personal belief, and it became a lawsuit worth millions. More recently, the Olympic movement and massive debate about the rights and the wrongs of various people to even compete in the Olympics because we are unable to prove or verify their gender. In a few years back, this woman in Connecticut sued the Connecticut State Board for Athletics. The previous year, all of the medals in track for females had been won and spread across 10 different female individuals. Pretty fair spread. The following year, they were all won by the 2 people you see pictured up there, neither of whom were born female. And yet the athletics board allowed them to compete in a female sport, in a female competition, and they won everything against objective reality. Our world is going crazy. That's how it feels. It feels like that to me. And so what we want to do today is I've got a very particular message I'm hoping you'll all be able to leave with, and it's this. If you feel like the world is going mad, if you feel uncomfortable by the things that you are seeing and you are reading and you are hearing, if at times you feel a sense of frustration, perhaps anger or revulsion about immoral lifestyles that you feel deny the objective realities that God himself has laid out, it's not you. The world is going mad. Don't get confused, brothers and sisters, and especially young people. Don't get confused by what's happening out there. You are not wrong to feel worried and concerned and at times frustrated and hurt for the Father's sake over the things that we see out there, about the evil we see spoken and acted out. The world is going mad. But God said that was exactly what would happen in the last days. We're going to look at that now. And hopefully as we look at it, we'll get that sense that the events we're seeing, we can't let them undermine our faith. God knew this would happen. His Son told us it would happen. Yes, it's tough, but he understands. So into Revelation 16. We read in Revelation 16 from the beginning of that sixth vial that was poured out. It says there that the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates. Water thereof was dried up, and the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And we know, don't we, brothers and sisters, broadly what this means. Rivers in the Bible are very clearly symbolic. Isaiah, for example, mentions the great Assyrian river, and he describes the Assyrian nation as this vast river overflowing its banks, spreading across the land, unstoppable by mere mortals. The king of Assyria and all his glory. And here again we read about the great river Euphrates. And so it's a representation of a nation that holds the territories, that possesses the headwaters of many rivers. We believe it to speak of, well, the Ottomans and in the end, perhaps even Turkey. And this is, we've been saying this for a long, long time. Most of us have heard it from Help Us Israel classes or Eureka or Bible studies or lectures or something along the line. But this has been a widespread view of people who have studied the book of Revelation for forever. Way back in 1605, Thomas Brightman was already saying this. This was before the Ottomans even hit their zenith. He was saying that this river represented the Ottomans. James Durham, Robert Fleming, John Cole, George Faber, all of them predate Brother Thomas saying the same thing. And just for the fun of it, I thought I'd show you James Durham's book in 1657. It's sometimes fun to look at old books, I think, and maybe this is one that some of you have got at home on your nightstand right now, perhaps, I don't know. But James Durham's commentary upon the book of Revelation. And he says this. And what I'm trying to reassure you here is we're not saying anything new or anything different that hasn't been said for a very long time, because it's pretty straightforward. He says this. By the same reason, then, Euphrates here must be understood to be the people for the time inhabiting there. In other words, Euphrates represents the people who live in the region of the Euphrates. And because not only in the verity of the thing, in other words, the truth of the matter, the Turks now possess that part of the world, he goes on to say, Turkey and the Ottoman Empire can be considered to be this great river Euphrates. And so when James Durham was writing, The Ottoman Empire was at its absolute zenith, and he was already saying we should expect to see the Ottoman Empire shrinking, being dried up, and that's exactly what we saw, even though in James Durham's time nothing could have looked further from the truth. By 1829, the Ottoman Empire had shrunk. 60 years later, it was smaller again. By 1913, they were a fragment of their former selves. 1920, as the British moved north, there was very, very little left. And finally, late in 1920, the last vestiges fell, and for a short period, there was not even a Turkey as the British occupied Istanbul. The river dried up. And we exist in the point of time after the drying up has commenced, perhaps even the drying up is complete, but before the events of verse 16. We know Armageddon hasn't happened, of course. It's very plain, therefore, that because those verses 13 and 14 and so on are the events in between the drying up that finishes 1920-ish and the Battle of Armageddon, that these are the verses that relate to our time. We live in that period of time. Now, the eagle-eyed among you may just have noticed that up there on the screen I've missed verse 15. And then we'll circle back to that by and by. And so, Brother Thomas, when he looked at this passage, he talked about the drying up of the Euphrates, and he says that the water would be dried up by that the way of the kings of the sun's rising might be prepared. He saw this as a real action by God that would prepare for the return of Christ and the arrival of the saints. And in writing the way he read the next verse, he said, "And I saw out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like to frogs, for they are the spirits of demons working wonders, and they go forth to the kings of the world." And again, we know this stuff, don't we? We know who they are. There's a few different ways, I guess, of slicing and dicing that dragon and that beast and that false prophet. You can view the dragon as being the military aspect of the kingdom of men, of the Catholic-dominated machinery that has conquered this globe. The beast could be representative of the political side, the political arm of that faction of the world. And the false prophet. Well, false prophets, that's an interesting one. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but the first time the false prophet ever occurs in the Bible is in this verse that we're reading. He doesn't show up in the story of Revelation or anywhere else until we get to, well, the time just before the Battle of Armageddon. And look, I don't know for sure, but it does make me wonder. I wonder whether perhaps this symbol of the false prophet speaks not so much of an ongoing institution over the eras, but rather of one particular individual, one man. Perhaps a man who is named in heaven's plan for the future. A named individual who will emerge just before Christ's return. Maybe we already know his name and don't know he's the one, or maybe he is still to emerge. But maybe that final pope will be the false prophet spoken of here. A man who, according to Revelation, exists from the period of just before Armageddon to the period just a little bit after. Well, that's one way of slicing and dicing it, but of course, we also know there's another way of viewing those symbols, aren't they? We see the dragon speaking of Russia and Eastern Europe, the beast of the EU and Western Europe, and the false prophet as speaking specifically of that mouthpiece of Catholicism, the Pope himself. And we can mark these places on a map if we choose to do so. We know roughly where they are. These are the regions, if you like, of the empire of Catholicism. that's not where Christ is going with this vision, is it? Because Christ says, I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. What I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about these frog-like spirits soon. We're going to go into the frog-like spirits to sort of try and make sure we really understand what they are. But before we get there, I wanted to ask another question, and the question is this. How are the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet responsible for these spirits? How are they the source? Because what he didn't see is 3 frog-like spirits who motivated the beast and the dragon and the false prophet. No, it was the other way around. The spirits come from the beast and the dragon and the false prophets. And in the past, when we talked about these frog-like spirits, we simplified our explanation to say that the 3 spirits speak of the humanistic doctrines of liberty and fraternity and equality, those catch cries of the French Revolution. And look, there is no doubt a lot of truth in this. But how were the dragon and the beast and the false prophet the cause of these humanistic doctrines? How were they the cause of these doctrines that were so powerful, that are so powerful, that they're going to drive the whole world to the Battle of Armageddon? So, maybe I'm not being particularly clear. To be very clear, if I can, about what I'm trying to answer here is, these spirits came out of their mouths, out of their minds, not the other way round. The frog-like spirits each originate from, presumably, one from the dragon, one from the beast, one from the false prophet. All 3 are components of the Catholic guided kingdom of men. And so what we're being told here is that somehow Catholicism will be the cause of this spirit. And so what we want to do is find out how that happened. And we're going to try and trace that back and answer the question of how are these Catholic systems responsible for these frog-like spirits? We want to trace the origin of that thinking that resulted in the spirit of madness that our King warned us would infect our world in the age of the end. And what I'm going to give you now is, look, it's a grossly abbreviated, potted history of the development of the spirit of humanism that first saw its real expression in the French Revolution. And for those of you who are students of these things, you are going to cringe. I apologize in advance. We're going to jump and make some real leaps and move pretty quickly to get through this. But nonetheless, we're going to try and trace down the eras of European development, starting with the early church, and find out where the key teachings emerged that are going to end up in this insanity that leads the whole world to Armageddon. So let's go back, right back to the early church. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing less than 100 years, just a little over 100 years after the death of the Lord Jesus Christ, said that every church should agree with this church, his church. And that the church and the teachings of the church had been committed into the hands of their bishop and their episcopate. Ignatius, who died about 100 years after the work of the Apostle Paul, said that he that honours the bishop honours God. He that doth aught without the knowledge of the bishop, well, they render service to the devil. And what we're seeing in these writings, very soon after the work of the apostles began to finish because of them passing away, is the replacement of the authority of God with the authority of the church. Listen to the bishops, they said. Listen to the church. This was putting a human system above the words of God. Now, at the same time, roughly, there was another stream of thought entering the system. This is a little bit later on, but it's kind of parallel. There was a community called the Desert Fathers. And the Desert Fathers believed that our salvation rested on man meriting the merit of Christ, rather than seeing it as a result of grace coupled with good works from a grateful heart. Now, they thought you merit salvation. And the way you merited salvation if you're a desert father is you went out into the desert, you lived a very uncomfortable life. If your life was not uncomfortable, you found ways to make it more uncomfortable, usually by living in not very good places, with not very good food, and I presume very uncomfortable clothing. They believed that a life of suffering meant that you earned salvation. And so they lived these austere lives of isolation to earn God's gift. And these streams of thought affected what came after. In the Middle Ages, probably one of the greatest Catholic thinkers throughout that time was Thomas Aquinas. I'm sure there are multiple Aquinas colleges scattered throughout Victoria, as there are in Western Australia and just about everywhere else, dedicated to the thinkings of this man. But there's something very unusual about what Thomas Aquinas did in his writing, because he leaned frequently upon the teaching of someone he described as the philosopher. As you go through his writings, he talks about the philosopher this, the philosopher that, the philosopher said. And you see, he was actually referring to Aristotle. But he had a problem, of course. You see, Aristotle didn't believe in, well, he didn't believe in Jesus, and he didn't believe in God. He believed in Zeus and Hermes and a whole bunch of other Greek gods. And so he couldn't really kind of use them as an authentic reference, because he wasn't a Christian, he was a pagan of all things, and yet Aquinas found himself drawn to the teachings of the philosopher. And so he writes of him using this term. And you see, what he did is he pulled the teachings of Aristotle and he threaded it into Christian thinking. And what he came up with was this idea that during the fall in the garden, oh yes, man fell. We were sullied, we were guilt-stricken. Man became mortal and corrupted and dying, but not his intellect. The intellect of man remained pure and unsullied. Yes, the will of man was corrupt, but the intellect of man, that was untouched. And you see, what he began to do was build a teaching from Catholicism that elevated human thought and intellect. And before long, human thought and human intellect became central to Catholic theology. By the time the Renaissance rolled on, the intellectual basis of the church and of society at large derived its understandings from Roman and Greek philosophy. They believe that man is the measure of all things. And in this time of unfurling of new wisdoms during the Renaissance, as we began towards this accelerating liberation of man from the constraints of God, or even from the constraints of the Catholic corruption of God's law, the Renaissance lent on this idea of the purity and the power of the intellect of man, and that man is the absolute center of all things, so much so that you end up with paintings like this. Now, this is a painting by Raphael. For those of you who love your art, you'll notice the signature colours there. And in this painting called The School of Athens, in the centre of the painting are two characters, two men. The one in the rear, older, in kind of, is that peach? I don't know. Someone here will know exactly what colour. Chartreuse, I don't know. Whatever he's chosen to wear on this particular day. This man is Plato. And you can see he's old, he's wearied, but he points upwards, speaking of his philosophy of absolutes and of ideals and of a divine mandate, that there were absolute rights and wrongs in the universe. But in front of him, leading, more powerful, more youthful, and pointing downwards towards the material earth, is Aristotle, the philosopher, speaking of man's ability to influence material, his intellectual ability to change the world around him and to influence everything, the centrality of the human figure. Oh, neat, good. Where's this painting? Anyone seen it? Some of you bound to have dropped in and seen it. It's in the residence of the Pope in Rome. And you can see in this the way that Aquinas was thinking. You can see Aquinas' elevation of the intellect, entering the artworks of men like Raphael, or for that matter, here's Leonardo da Vinci and his famous Vitruvian Man. And I'm sure we've all seen this rather unusual picture and wondered why it's a good thing. Well, what this picture was, it was taken from a Roman architect by the name of Vitruvius. And Vitruvius described the human figure as being the principal source of proportion of all architecture. And he said, man is the center of the universe. And then, almost 1,000 years later, Leonardo da Vinci picks up this thing. More than 1,000 years later, Leonardo picks this up and he draws this picture to describe the way that the human is the center of all things. Dante's Divine Comedy. We don't have time to talk too much about it, but in it, he's walking through hell and he meets all these different people, and the people who help him are all intellectuals from the Roman age, like Virgil and others, and the ones who hinder him, well, they're people who were like, Brutus and Cassius. And he says, in hell, we see those who rejected spiritual values by yielding to bestial appetites and violence. But those who are intellectual, doesn't matter whether they're Christian, they are guides. Or this, much later now, Michelangelo's David. Anyone here seen this? In the marble? Yes, a few of you have. And of course, we will all know the justification for this magnificent statue, that passage in the Bible where it says, and David stood there with no clothes on. There was no justification for this statue, for a naked statue of David. And at the time, it was called David merely to sort of cover the reason for doing it. Everybody in Florence, where it was constructed, knew that it was a statement more on the beauty of man and his intellect. And it was used as a rallying cry in Florence for the common man. It was actually a unionist statement supporting the everyman worker against the Medicis at the time in Florence. And it was saying the common man is wonderful. It was a political statement about the liberties of humanity. So by the time we arrive in the Enlightenment, the cat was out of the bag. Humanity was beginning to disconnect from God, beginning to deny God's authority and elevate human thinking above all else. This man, for example, most of us have been through high school, have encountered his teaching, because this is Descartes, who came up with Cartesian logic. He's described as the father of the scientific age. And what he did is he shifted the debate from what is true, what is absolutely true, to of what can I be certain. He shifted the authentic and authoritative guarantor of truth from God to humanity. Now, this is despite the fact that Descartes himself claimed, he was a very Catholic man. Yes, he helped the Protestant government at times, but he was Catholic through and through. He was raised by Jesuits. He claimed to have visions from God himself, and yet he demolished the concept of truth. He said, I think, therefore I am. In other words, the things I sense, I feel, I decide are truth. And you might have heard this saying, for me. My truth, it starts with Descartes. Rousseau, again, influenced on and off by various Catholics, but he was the foundation character behind the French Revolution in that his writings served as the mantra and the reason Robespierre, the architect of large part of the French Revolution, did what he did. And he wrote and believed firmly, as he says here, that man is naturally good. He looked at the savages and he said, oh, everything they do innately is good. Now, I'm not sure what savages he was looking at, but he invented this romantic concept that champions sentimentality over logic and caprice over common sense, instinct over civilization, mythicism over clarity. And he said, whatever we think and whatever we feel is better. And so by the time the French Revolution rolled in, we have people like George Eliot, and some of us will have read her books, but she wrote that the fellowship between man and man, which has been the principle of all development, all growth, all knowledge comes from men, is not dependent on conceptions of what is not man. The idea of God, so far as it has been a high spiritual influence, is, well, she says, it's the ideal of goodness entirely human. And she was going to be a founding figure in what was called the Theophilanthropists, a movement which was described as the lovers of God and man. But, well, this became the foundation religion of the French Revolution, and it quickly got shortened to the philanthropists, the lovers of men, the Parisian Society of Philanthropy. It's a very short step from there to what we see today. The exaltation of human will and intellect, and most important of all, desire above all else. Paul Kurtz said, no deity will save us. We must save ourselves. And Thomas Paine, the Bible is where we learn cruelty, rapine and murder. It's God's fault. Not that he believed in God. You see, the teaching that elevates the intellect of man above all else, and our right to decide what is true, and this is the important point, our right, not our right collectively, our right individually and personally to decide what is truth. True for me, whether it's true for you, I don't care. That truth comes from Catholicism. It was Catholicism who let the philosophical cat out of the bag. It was them who let humanism, this elevation of the rights of man above everything else, out. And now the dragon and the beast and the false prophet, they speak it. It comes out of their mouths. And you say, well, how did that happen? How do we see that? How did this doctrine come directly out of their mouths? You showed this earlier, the slide earlier, but I want to make the point here that the French Revolution wasn't the moment that the frog-like spirit of madness exploded into the public view for all of these entities at the same time. In fact, each of these entities was racked by its very own revolution in its own time, motivated by the very same thinking of Catholicism that Catholicism had originally unleashed. There were three separate frog-like spirits erupting, one from each mouth. The new seat of the dragon, the third Rome, Moscow, was ravaged by violence. The Tsar and his family were massacred as the equality of every man, their shared ownership of all, communism, started a fire that would result in the oppression of all Eastern Europe for almost half a century and change the course of the world. We know about the beast's revolution. The French kingdom was racked with a revolution driven by the intellectual ideals of humanism, inspired by Catholic thought, and it toppled the monarchy, shook monarchies all around the world, elevated the middle class, sending shockwaves through every monarchy in Europe, and resulted in a fundamental change in thinking about the fellowship of humanity worldwide that's never stopped. And of course, the false prophet, well, his territory was racked by revolution as well when Victor Emmanuel and Garibaldi marched across Italy, unifying a fractured kingdom and finally imprisoning the Pope in his own palace. And the consequence of this was that this man, who for a long time had been able to be militant and raise his own armies, was now forced to act only behind closed doors. He had different weapons he needed to use, and he began to be a far more insidious influence, changing the way the world thinks through his writings and his speakings about the liberty of man, changing the world with words and ideas, one infant baptism at a time. So each of these had their own revolution. We might say, well, is that it? Is that what happened? Well, Winston Churchill was, of course, asked, you may remember this, what was the impact of the French Revolution? And his answer? It's too early to say. He wrote that over 100 years after the French Revolution. Too early to tell. French Revolution is still not done. And nor are any of the other revolutions. We might say, okay, well, what's the impact of the Dragon's Revolution? What's happening there with that frog-like spirit? It's found its way into the language and the thinking of every socialist government, every social justice warrior, every youth movement across the Western world. All men are equal. We have equal rights. The French Revolution spawned a movement for European fraternity and the brotherhood of man. Rebuilding the Tower of Babel, breaking down the walls that individual languages had built up, and unifying humanity under one banner, that we might speak one language and have one thought to elevate humanity. And the Pope's revolution of individual liberty continues to spread as every man more and more feels at leisure to say, I can do whatever I want because God loves me. Or better yet, doesn't exist. And so the dragon and the beast and the false prophet spoke. But the spirit we're told is like a frog. What does that mean? Why like a frog? Well, in Revelation, the Lord Jesus Christ gives us information in a code. He had to do that because he knew the book of Revelation was going to fall into enemy hands. He knew the Catholics would get hold of this, and so he wrote it in code. He knew that would never break. He knew that they would never care about the whole Bible, and so he wrote it in the code of the Old Testament. And so when we want to understand this, we unpack it using things that Jesus said himself and things from the Old Testament to help us unveil what's going on in there. And he encoded this particular passage. He's talking about frogs. And we think to ourselves, why did he choose frogs? I mean, he could have chosen anything, couldn't he? I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, the mouth of the false prophet and the beast, a spirit like pigs. And we have learned something from that. And he chose frogs. Why frogs? And most of you hopefully are going, right now, frogs. Frogs in the Bible. Only one story, right? Just one. You know it. Here it is. This is the only story in the Bible about frogs. Actually, did you know that the word for frogs in the Old Testament has an Egyptian origin? Now that's interesting, isn't it? Why would it have an Egyptian origin? And here we are, the only story in the Bible about frogs. The only passages that ever talk about frogs is this passage here, or passages talking about this passage here, of which there are only 2 in the Psalms. 10 plagues, here are the frogs. Covered the land of Egypt. So here's the 2 in the Psalms. It says he sent flies, which devoured them, and frogs, which destroyed them. What does that mean? What is this telling us about what we're reading in Revelation? Destroy them? Like, I don't know how many of you have had a pet frog, but they're kind of not a very destroy-y type animal, you know? A large Doberman? Yes. Not many frogs the size of a Doberman. Destroy? But you see, this word, the first time it shows up is in the context of the flood, and it's the word, the world was corrupt and full of violence. Corrupt. It speaks of moral decay and corruption. And you see, the Lord selected this symbol to help us understand a spirit which comes from Catholic humanism but drives our world mad. And he says, look, it's something that corrupts. It morally corrupts. And then in Psalm 105, now this one, it's almost like a lurking prophecy in some ways. The land brought forth frogs in abundance in the chambers of their kings. And you think, oh, they didn't have kings. They had a king, Pharaoh. It's almost like it's waiting there for 1,000 years' time for the Lord to pick it up and use the symbol of the frog to describe an influence that would drive the kings of the earth to Armageddon. And when we come back to this story, when we use the code left behind for those who love our Father's word and all that he said, he says that these frog-like spirits that trigger Armageddon, yes, there'll be a corrupting influence that will particularly affect kings, those at the pinnacle of power in their countries and states. But there's additional detail given for us here, and you can see it. I've highlighted it for you. It wasn't just the kings that were influenced in Egypt. No, the frogs in this plague went everywhere. They got into every level of society. They were in the house of Pharaoh. They were into the houses of the nobility. They were into the houses of the common man. Every class of citizen, every type of person was affected by the corrupting, destroying influence of these frogs. In fact, this point was so remarkable that in this occasion, Moses tells this story twice so that we don't miss the point that it's every level of society that is impacted by the frogs. And this is the only time in the rest of the Bible that frogs show up. We're being told, aren't we? This influence corrupts. And it will be in every level of society, particularly affecting kings. It's a thinking that comes from Catholicism, but it will drive the world mad. And of course, this wasn't the only piece of coded detail that the Lord, our King, left for us. He's helping us see, he's helping us identify these creeping, all-invading influences. Back in Revelation 16, John was shown frog-like spirits that we're told were the spirits of devils. And in so doing, our Lord uses a very, very specific word. And just like the idea of frogs, this word is only used in one story in the Bible. It's a Greek word that shows up in just one story in the whole of the New Testament, in the Lord's ministry. And to make sure that we don't miss it, this word is used in all three gospel records of this particular story. John doesn't include this particular story for what it's worth. The word there, devils, is the word daimon, or in English, demon. It's only ever used in the story of Legion. Legion had an unclean spirit, and yes, that just happens to be exactly the same Hebrew as the unclean spirits like frogs as well, so Greek as the unclean spirits like frogs. But the word we're interested in here was that this man was driven by the devil, by a demon into the wilderness. A man so incredibly mad that no one would go near him. You could not travel down his path. Chains could not hold this man. He was raging amongst the tombs and sobbing in the night. He was a danger to himself and all who went near him. And he had a devil, a demon. And that unmistakably serves as the key here because it's never used in any other story. Oh yes, there were others who had daimonians. They were demon influenced. That's what daimonian means. But this man wasn't just influenced by demons. He had a demon. He was driven by one. Poor Legion was insane. He was afflicted by a cacophony of malignant, destructive voices. And for those of you who are not sure what insanity is, by the way, it is not a medical term, it's a legal term, and it describes this condition in which you are unable to make decisions morally. You're blind to the moral implications of the things that you are doing. And you see, this is where humanism has gone. Society is fragmented into smaller and smaller and louder tribes, aided by the anonymity that the internet provides and amplified by the media. Each faction and each activist group is convinced of its own right, is convinced that its rights are more important than the others and their rights should be heard and acted on by all, even at the expense of everyone else. And so we've got Antifa and social justice warriors and incels and LGBTQI, militant feminism and male defense, white rights and Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement and vegan activism, and every single one of these groups is screaming to all around them that their cause trumps all the rest until they too fragment and eventually anarchy reigns. And that's what this man was. He was uncontrollably and impossibly strong. He was a force to be reckoned with. And as we read at times through this tale, we can understand the spirit of Legion and why God wanted us to understand Legion in the context of this thinking, because the motivating spirit in our world today is just like this man. Legion's insanity caused him to deny objective realities, to be incapable of moral decision-making. And so he was incurably dangerous. His was a spirit that saw the things that Christ could offer as torture. It is a spirit that sees itself as sane while Christ and his followers appear insane to those so afflicted. And it's a spirit not with just one voice, but 1,000. He said, one legion. So many voices screaming in his head at the same time. He thought he was the one who should help Jesus get rid of his demons. I enjoy thee, he said to Jesus. And he felt tormented and punished by the Lord. Does that sound like the world you live in? Christ left a code to show us exactly what the Spirit would look like when it manifested in the kingdoms of men. This is the most unscientific graph of all time. I got it by just Googling how many gender identities are there and limiting the time I would accept results from. Show me the answers from 2020. That's all I did here. Now, obviously, at some point, if I'd surveyed, the beginning, it would have said 2, Adam and Eve. You can see, 112. 112 competing voices. 112. And yet, those that believe the teachings of Christ are the ones who are insane. And you see, that is the point, brothers and sisters. This humanistic Catholic thinking unleashed by Catholicism, it will infect all levels of society. It's the spirit of madness. And it is what brings the world to Armageddon. And he started by saying we lived between these two events. We know that we live in verse 15. And I don't know, we're going to finish on verse 15. I don't know how many of you have read this way before, but there's something really unusual in verse 15 because it says, "Behold, I come as a thief." Think, okay, great. I want you to look back at verse 13. He says, "And I saw 3 unclean spirits." Who saw? Well, John did. John saw 3 unclean spirits who were shown them by Jesus Christ. And so when we read verse 15 there, "Behold, I come," you think, oh, John's coming. Oh, of course, we all know that's nonsense. That's not what it's saying there, is it? It's Christ speaking. But do you see how unusual it is that there's no introduction? There's no moment in which Christ says, or John says, "And the Lord said to me, write, John," and I wrote. And the Lord said, "Behold, I come as a thief." That's not there. And I can kind of picture this situation. And just follow with me for a moment. Because every time I read this, it really does send shivers down my spine. John's writing this stuff. There's the Euphrates and the dragon, the beast and the false prophet and the unclean spirits and all the kings going to Armageddon. And this is really intense stuff. And he gets up, thinks maybe it's time for a coffee. And he comes back and he looks down at his scroll and there's writing in the scroll. And he thinks, that's not my handwriting. And he recognises their handwriting. It's the unique handwriting of someone he'd seen writing in the dust on the pavers in the temple. It was the writing of the one he loved. It was the writing of the Messiah. It's almost as if Christ could not trust anyone else to write these words. John comes back and without any introduction, there's the words of Christ, and then verse 16, we're back into the text again without any outro either. It's like Christ says, I can't trust anyone else to say these words. I will say them myself. And there's a reason for that. You see, these words are not written to the entire audience of Revelation. They're written to the audience of Revelation who exist in the time between verse 14 and verse 15. In the time where the gathering is occurring, the madness is unfurling in the Battle of Armageddon. Who's that? And young people, that's you. And it's us. Christ wrote those words just for us. And it was so important, he didn't let John write that. And he said, watch. How do we watch? The way we watch is spend time with the other watchers. We love him with all of our hearts and our souls, and we don't stop till we find him. God bless.